city quickly became gridlocked with traffic. There's a mood of desperation developing now. Many people just jumping into their cars, getting their families together and heading on the road, trying to get to Poland. But the main auto routes are all jammed. There are so many people trying to do the same thing. Others are going underground, taking shelter. Others have been flocking to the supermarkets and frantically stocking up on essential items. This was the scene in Kramatorsk in the east of Ukraine as shoppers grabbed what they could to fill their cupboards. The Ukrainian army and air force are putting up a fight and resisting the Russian attack. This video from the Defense Ministry said to show a Russian helicopter shot down by Ukrainian forces near Kiev. But there will be no reinforcements from NATO, and the odds look heavily stacked against Ukraine's forces. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
Russia had been preparing to invade Ukraine for months. Nearly 200,000 soldiers were deployed around the country, including near the rebel-held areas of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east, and in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Russia has attacked the capital, Kiev, and the major cities of Kharkiv, Mariupol and Dnipro. And its military immediately targeted Ukraine's air defences, as well as Kiev's main airport and air bases in several other cities. Russian military vehicles have been deployed from Crimea and Belarus, where Russian troops were taking part in joint military drills. And in the east, the Ukrainian military says it's killed 50 troops in Luhansk region and downed 6 Russian warplanes. Well, Ukraine says Russian forces took the Antonov International Airport at Hostomel, but there are conflicting reports as to whether it's been regained. Russian military has also taken the Chernobyl nuclear plant. This video from inside the zone appears to confirm their control. It's the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster and lies just 130 kilometres from the capital. The exploded reactor is covered by a protective shelter to prevent radiation leak, and the entire plant has been decommissioned. President Zelensky says attacking it is a declaration of war against the whole of Europe. More than 1,400 people have been arrested at anti-war protests across Russia. That's according to the OVD Info Monitoring Group. Thousands turned out at anti-war protests in at least 50 cities, including Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk and St. Petersburg. Earlier, the Ukrainian president had addressed Russians directly, saying people needed to know the truth and asking if Russia's citizens wanted the war. Some activists have turned to solo picketing instead of trying to organise protests, though they too have been quickly detained or moved on. Others are finding ways to protest without demonstrating, including these women on the St. Petersburg subway with "No War" stitched onto their bags. Let's go now to Bernard Smith in Moscow. Let's start, Bernard, with what they're saying there in Russia about how the invasion is going so far.
Well, Lauren, we heard earlier about the sanctions that the United States is going to impose on Russia, and the European Union and the United Kingdom are doing similar. But the Kremlin has been expecting this, and the Kremlin spokesman said earlier this evening that they have enough safety tools to survive market volatility. Dmitry Peskov, he's the Kremlin spokesman, he said what he called the emotional reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine would eventually even out, and he said it will be impossible to shut off Russia behind an iron curtain. And the foreign ministry also saying that this war between Russia and Ukraine, between Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, has been going on for 8 years. Now they say it's ending.
Just a few hours after launching the biggest invasion of a European country since the Second World War, it looked like business as usual at the Kremlin. Pakistan's Prime Minister was the guest. But might Vladimir Putin's mind have been elsewhere? As the two men talked, Russia's military was advancing in Ukraine. These trucks were headed from Crimea to the Ukrainian border, part of an army that had surrounded a country of 40 million people. A country that Russia's president has said he doesn't think should exist. In an address to Russians and Ukrainians, Putin said his aim was to demilitarize Ukraine, and he made clear his antipathy for the government in Kiev.
I have to also address the Ukrainian military. Dear comrades, your fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers fought against the Nazis defending our common motherland. Not for today's neo-Nazis to take power in Kiev. You took the oath of allegiance to the Ukrainian people, not the junta robbing Ukraine and bullying its own people. Do not follow its criminal orders. I urge you to immediately lay down your weapons and go home.
Russia's defence ministry says it's met all its targets for Thursday, destroying 83 ground facilities of the Ukrainian military. And it insists they're not targeting civilian areas.
The high-precision weapons of the Russian armed forces only destroy the military infrastructure. These are objects of air defense, military airfields, aviation of the armed forces of Ukraine. Staged video filming with mass casualties among the civilian population was filmed in Ukrainian cities.
There have been some attempts in Russia to protest against the invasion. Several hundred turned out in Moscow. They're shouting no to war. Judging the Russian public's reaction is difficult because it's almost impossible to protest freely here. But Vladimir Putin's approval rating was at 69% in the build-up to the war.
Russia plans to take over the entirety of Ukraine. Not just the Donbass, not just Kiev, all of the country, because you can't ensure demilitarization. Demilitarization means total destruction of the Ukrainian military. Its personnel should go home, its weapons should be captured or destroyed, and the country as it is will not be anymore.
Vladimir Putin's day ended with a meeting of businessmen. If they're worried about sanctions, no one mentioned it. Russia's central bank says it's got $631 billion in cash reserves to cushion the economy if it's closed off from the global financial system.
Lauren, one of the objectives the Russian military says it's achieved in its first day of assault on this invasion of Ukraine is unblocking a canal that supplies water to Crimea. This canal was blocked after Russia was blocked by the Ukrainians after Russia annexed Crimea, creating a severe water shortage in the Crimea. Now that canal has been unblocked. The water is not flowing yet to Crimea, but a significant step and one of the major objectives the Russians had. And while they say they've achieved all their objectives for Thursday, this is only the beginning of what many people now are expecting is a full-on invasion right to the centre of Ukraine and the Ukrainian capital. Lauren.
Bernard Smith, thank you very much indeed. US President Joe Biden says Vladimir Putin will become a pariah on the international stage. He's joined the UK in sanctioning Russia's major banks and members of President Putin's inner circle. The EU is meeting to finalise its measures, but China has so far refused to refer to the attack as an invasion. Eve Barker has more from London.
As missiles fell on Ukrainian cities, so international condemnation rained down on Vladimir Putin and the Russian attack.
Early this morning, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a free and sovereign country. And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack.
From national capitals, leader after leader promised a coordinated and unprecedented sanctions response aimed at President Putin, the Russian elite, and the sources and havens of Russian wealth, hoping against hope that they will make a difference.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy.
We're taking new powers to target Russian finance.
Earlier, the British Prime Minister also announced a salvo of sanctions, banning Russian companies from its markets and Russia's national airline from British airports. The measures include asset freezes against major Russian state banks and individuals and a halt on high-tech exports. Those responsible for propping up Putin, he said, will have nowhere to hide.
This includes all the major manufacturers that support Putin's war machine.
Describing the Russian president in an address to the nation as a dictator.
For all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free.
World leaders have, however, fallen short of banning Russia from the SWIFT international payment system through which Moscow receives foreign currency. Some European countries fear billions of dollars of Russian debt won't be repaid to European creditors if Moscow's forced out of the scheme. Ukraine's urged Western leaders to reconsider. And while determined efforts continue by a number of countries to supply Ukraine with lethal and defensive weapons, no one's offering to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kiev and fight.
We have made it clear that we don't have any plans and intention of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. What we have made clear is that we have already increased, and we are increasing the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance on NATO territory.
That will not be a factor in Putin's plans for now, and neighbouring countries have other problems to consider. The Polish government says 9 reception points will be opened along Ukraine's border to receive an expected wave of refugees. A country that in recent months has used force to repel refugees from the Middle East must now brace for Ukrainians fleeing war in their thousands. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera.
Alan Fisher joins us live from the White House. Niamh mentioned there in passing the SWIFT system, and it seems that Biden isn't yet prepared to push Russia out of SWIFT. Talk us through what sanctions he has decided on and why not the SWIFT one.
Well, from my understanding, it's not that Joe Biden is against implementing sanctions on SWIFT. It's that there is objections from other members of the G7, notably Germany and Italy, who aren't ready to commit to that just yet. It's important to note that SWIFT isn't a payment system. A lot of people making that mistake. It's actually a messaging system, and then the banks make the payment. Joe Biden says that Russia needs to pay the price for invading Ukraine, and that is why he has introduced selective sanctions. He's targeting the financial sector. He's also making sure that it's much more difficult for the Russian military to gain access to Western technology. He's also targeting banks and financial institutions in Belarus for supporting Russia in the invasion. And that is essentially Joe Biden and the Western alliance sending a message to others: please do not help Russia with this, or else you too will face further sanctions. There's also a question as well why Vladimir Putin himself wasn't sanctioned. We didn't get an entirely clear answer from Joe Biden when he spoke in the last hour or so. The suggestion clearly is, though, that this is the first of what Joe Biden and the White House believes is a pretty stringent set of sanctions that can cause real havoc with the Russian economy, and there will be more to come if this isn't enough to start to repel those Russian forces. Now, it seems that even with the threat of sanctions, Vladimir Putin was willing to push forward. The threat of more sanctions might not be enough to force him to start pulling troops back.
And in the meantime, an attempt to perhaps guess what might come next from Putin with this decision to send more troops to Germany to bolster some of the NATO allies. Clearly, Ukraine is not in a NATO ally, but other countries around there are, aren't they?
It's about sending a message. And everyone keeps using the word that these are defensive operations, but sending 7,000 troops to other neighbouring NATO countries is showing that they don't want Russia to cross the borders into NATO countries. It's interesting that Joe Biden was asked if they go into any NATO countries, and then he said, well, then the United States would be involved and there would be American troops fighting because, of course, of Article 5 of the NATO articles, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. That has been invoked just once before. That was after the attacks in 9/11 in 2001. And so the US is aware that calling that into action means that other nations immediately rally to their side. They're hoping that won't be used throughout this entire crisis. We've always heard from the National Security Team at the White House that they're aware of the options available for Vladimir Putin. If he does X, then they will do Y. They have predicted many times correctly that he will do X, Y, and Z in this occasion, and they have been proven right, something that Joe Biden talked about during his address just in the last hour. And so the US seems to be prepared for what might come next. although speaking to one Russian expert in the last 24 hours, just judging what Vladimir Putin is doing and what he intends to do next, they've been watching Russia for a very long time, and they're not entirely sure what comes next.
Alan Fisher, thank you very much. Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the UN is scaling up its humanitarian efforts in Ukraine and that the protection of civilians must be the top priority. He also repeated his call for Russia to pull its troops back immediately.
The decisions of the coming days will shape our world and directly affect the lives of millions upon millions of people. In line with the Charter, it's not too late to save this generation from the scourge of war. We need peace.
Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, is live in Brussels. And James, within the last few minutes, it seems that the EU leaders have agreed on what they describe as massive sanctions. Tell us what they are.
Yeah, there's a statement just come out from the 27 leaders who have been meeting here in a summit meeting. Very quick, actually. They've only been meeting for an hour or so. As you say, Lauren, they say that they are going to impose what they call massive and severe consequences on Russia. These sanctions cover the financial sector, the energy and transport sectors, dual-use goods, as well as export control and export financing, visa policy, additional listings of Russian individuals, and new listing criteria. And now they also say that they are also preparing sanctions, not just on Russia, but also on Belarus, because clearly there have been Belarusian involvement in this. Belarusian troops, we think, have been involved, and certainly it's been a base for Russian troops to cross the border into Ukraine. So that's something coming forward from the EU at a later date. Clearly around the table of the EU, there have been very different views, I think. They are all united in their opposition to what Vladimir Putin has done. They say this crosses a line, it breaks the UN Charter, it's a breach of international law. But in terms of the response, I think some of the countries have a different view on this. And one of the things, you were talking to Alan about it a short time ago, is the SWIFT banking network. And some really wanted that to be included. Others, I think Germany and Italy, weren't so keen on that idea at this stage and wanted to leave something in reserve. The people who are unhappy about that, of course, are the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian foreign minister earlier on tweeted that those that didn't exclude Russia from SWIFT would also have blood on their hands. So what he himself, Dmytro Kuleba, described as an undiplomatic message, I think is being heard here in Brussels. That's not a step that they're taking at this time, but they still say that the sanctions they're putting on Russia are unprecedented.
And you would have been talking to people as they go into the meeting. What's their impression of how serious this is and how extended this conflict could get?
I think there's real concerns about how long this could take and what could be the consequences, particularly here in the EU, because you've seen the stream of people just in the first few hours of this who have been leaving from Kyiv and from other parts of Ukraine and trying to get their way across the border. The roads, we're told, are jammed. I've seen from senior UN sources an estimate